In 1897, in the records of the small village of Thornridge, Somerset County, England, there is a note that should not exist. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? It is a handwritten line, in faded ink, in the margin of a police report filed over a century ago. The handwriting is shaky, almost desperate. It simply says, "He left. He didn't come back. The road was empty." This sentence refers to Thomas Aldridge, a 32-year-old carpenter, father of 2 young children, married to Eleanor, daughter of a local miller. Thomas was known to everyone, an ordinary man, punctual, discreet, the kind who greets you with a nod and moves on. Thornridge, at the end of that century, was what remained of the old world before the railroads and the telegraph changed everything. It was a community of 300 souls, surrounded by wheat fields that rippled in the wind, moss-covered stone fences, and a perpetual mist that rose from the valley every morning like a silent ghost. The houses were grey stone, with roofs of thatch darkened by soot from the fireplaces. The streets were dirt tracks that turned to mud in the rainy months. There was no electricity. At night, the village was plunged into deep darkness, broken only by the faint glow of candles in the windows and the distant rustling of the trees. Life there was predictable. The men worked in the sawmill, on the farms, or in the mills. The women took care of the houses, the children, and the gardens. On Sundays, everyone gathered at the small St. Mary's Church, where Reverend Whitmore read the same psalms week after week in a deep, monotonous voice. Thomas Aldridge lived in a modest house on the southern edge of the village, where the main road branched off toward the oak woods that covered the hills. He had built that house with his own hands, board by board, in the early years of his marriage. It was simple but solid. It had 2 narrow windows, a chimney that smoked every morning, and a heavy wooden door that creaked when opened. Eleanor, his wife, was a woman with a soft voice and rough hands from washing clothes in the creek. She took care of their children, Arthur, 7, and little Margaret, only 3, with the quiet patience of someone who learned early on that life does not forgive distractions. Thomas worked in the carpentry shop of Jacob Henley, a sturdy man with a grey beard who had run the business for 40 years. There, Thomas repaired wagons, made simple furniture, window frames, and gates. The smell of sawdust permeated his clothes, his hands, his hair. It was a smell Eleanor recognized from afar when he returned home at dusk. Neighbors said Thomas was a man of few words, but reliable. If he promised something, he delivered. If he borrowed a tool, he returned it the next day, clean and sharp. He didn't drink in taverns. He didn't get involved in fights or gossip. He was the kind of man who went through life without making waves. But in the parish records, there is something strange. 3 weeks before his disappearance, Reverend Whitmore noted in the visitor's book that Thomas visited the church on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't Sunday. There was no mass. The Reverend simply wrote, "T. Aldridge came to ask about the old paths. I didn't know how to answer." He seemed disturbed. No one in the village knew for sure what these old paths were. Some said they were trails that the Celts used centuries ago, even before the Romans. Others thought it was just old people's superstition, stories told around the fire to scare children. But there was something about those woods that everyone avoided mentioning. On windy nights, when the trees swayed and groaned as if they were alive, the village elders recommended that doors be locked early, not for fear of thieves or animals, but because, according to them, the air changed when you went too far. Eleanor never publicly commented on Thomas's visit to the Reverend, but a neighbor, Mrs. Crowley, who lived 3 houses down, said years later in a statement to the police that she saw Eleanor crying at her doorstep one October afternoon. When she asked what had happened, Eleanor just shook her head and went inside, closing the door slowly. At the end of October 1897, Thomas Aldridge left home one Saturday morning before dawn, carrying only a kerosene lantern and a small axe. He told Eleanor he needed to chop wood in the nearby woods. It would be quick. He would be back before noon. He never returned. And in the official records, there is one last entry that no one has been able to explain. On the afternoon of that same Saturday, a farmer named William Grent said he saw Thomas at the edge of the woods, standing still, staring at something among the trees. When Grent called his name, Thomas did not respond. He just took a step forward and disappeared. To understand what happened that October morning, we must go back a few months when Thomas Aldridge's life still followed the predictable rhythm of Thornridge. It was April 1897. Spring was late that year, and the fields were still covered with a thin frost that was slow to melt under the pale sun. Thomas woke up every morning before dawn, lit the fire in the fireplace, heated water for tea, and left for the workshop while Eleanor prepared breakfast for the children. Arthur, the eldest son, already helped his father on Saturdays, carrying tools, sweeping up sawdust, learning to hold the hammer firmly. Thomas taught the boy in silence, showing him more than talking, as his own father had done with him. Margaret, the youngest, was still too young to understand the world around her. She spent her days clinging to her mother's skirt, playing with rag dolls and pieces of wood that her father brought from the workshop. Eleanor said the girl had her father's eyes, brown, deep, as if they were always watching something others couldn't see. Thomas's routine was strict. He arrived at Jacob Henley's workshop at 7 in the morning, worked until noon, stopped to eat bread and cheese and drink water from the well, and then returned to work until dusk. On Saturdays, he finished early, around 3 in the afternoon, to help Eleanor at home or tend to the small chicken coop they kept in the back. Jacob Henley, his boss, described Thomas years later as the best carpenter I ever had, but a man who carried something inside him that he never showed. Henley said that Thomas would sometimes stop in the middle of a task, plane in hand, and look out the workshop window toward the woods, as if he were listening to something. When Henley asked if everything was all right, Thomas would just nod and go back to work. But there were signs. In June of that year, Thomas began coming home later. Eleanor would ask where he had been, and he would reply that he needed to finish an urgent order, but Jacob Henley never confirmed any extra orders. When the police questioned him months later, Henley said that Thomas left the workshop at the usual time, but did not return directly home. Where he went, no one knew. One afternoon, Mrs. Crowley saw Thomas walking alone down the road that led to the woods, already at dusk, when the golden light of the sun was disappearing behind the hills. She called out to him, asked if he needed help, but he just waved from afar and kept walking, as if he were following something only he could see. Eleanor never spoke openly about it with her neighbors, but Reverend Whitmore noted in his personal diary, discovered decades later, that Eleanor confessed to him in August that Thomas wasn't the same anymore. She said he would wake up in the middle of the night, sit on the edge of the bed, and sit there, motionless, staring at the wall. When she touched his shoulder, he would shudder, as if he had been torn from a distant place. He also began to ask strange questions. He asked Jacob Henley if he knew any old stories about the woods, about trails that led to places that didn't exist on maps. Henley laughed, thinking Thomas was just bored, and suggested he go to the tavern for a beer with the other men. Thomas thanked him, but never went. He asked Reverend Whitmore about the old ways, the paths the Celts supposedly used to cross the hills unseen. The Reverend said they were just legends, stories of illiterate peasants who attributed magic to ordinary hunting trails. Thomas listened quietly, thanked him, and left. But what intrigued the Reverend most was Thomas's look as he left the church. It was the look of someone who had already made up his mind. In September, Eleanor found something under the bed. It was a piece of yellowed paper folded several times with a rough charcoal drawing on it. It looked like a map. It showed the village of Thornridge, the main road, and then a series of winding lines that went into the woods, up the hills toward a point marked with an X. Eleanor asked Thomas what it was. He slowly took the paper from her hands and said only, "It's nothing. Forget about it." She never brought it up again. But in the last few days before his disappearance, Thomas changed. He became more present, more attentive. He played with Arthur, teaching the boy how to make a small wooden boat. He picked Margaret up, and sang an old song that his own mother used to sing. He hugged Eleanor in the kitchen for no apparent reason and whispered, "You're a good woman, better than I deserve." Eleanor said years later in a trembling testimony that it felt like a farewell. On Friday night, the eve of his disappearance, Thomas dined with his family in silence. He ate slowly, chewing each piece of bread as if memorizing its taste. After dinner, he sat by the fireplace watching the flames dance while Eleanor put the children to bed. When she returned, Thomas was still there, motionless, his eyes fixed on the fire. She asked if he was okay. He nodded. She asked if he loved her. He turned to her, held her hand, and said, "Always." The next morning before sunrise, Thomas got up, put on his heavy wool coat, took the kerosene lantern and the small axe. Eleanor was still asleep. He looked at her for a long moment, then looked at their children, wrapped in blankets, breathing softly. He left the house quietly. The last person to see him alive was William Grent, the farmer, who was driving his wagon down the main road. He saw Thomas standing at the edge of the woods, the lantern still lit in his left hand, even though daylight was beginning to brighten the sky. Thomas was staring into the forest, motionless, like a statue. Grent shouted, "Thomas, are you all right?" Thomas did not answer. He just took a step forward and disappeared among the trees. Grent said he waited a few seconds, thinking Thomas would return, but the woods remained silent, a silence that was not natural. Grent whipped the horses and rode on, feeling a chill run down his spine. He didn't know he would never see Thomas Aldridge again. Eleanor waited until noon. Sitting at the kitchen table, her hands clasped in her lap, she looked out the narrow window toward the road that led to the woods. Arthur played on the floor with pieces of wood. Margaret slept in her mother's lap, breathing softly. The fire in the fireplace crackled quietly. The house was silent, but it was a heavy silence, heavy with waiting. Thomas had said he would be back before noon. The wall clock, a wedding gift from Eleanor's father, struck 12:15, then 1 o'clock, then 2. Eleanor got up, put Margaret in her crib, and told Arthur to take care of his sister. She put on her wool shawl and went out onto the road, walking slowly, looking from side to side, waiting to see Thomas emerge from behind a tree, with his axe on his shoulder and that tired look he always had. She walked to the edge of the woods. There the road ended and gave way to a narrow trail covered with dry leaves and fallen branches. The trees were ancient oaks with wide trunks covered in dark green moss and twisted vines. Sunlight barely penetrated the dense canopy, creating a cold, damp gloom that made her skin crawl. Eleanor stopped at the edge of the trail and shouted, "Thomas!" Her voice echoed among the trees, but there was no answer. She shouted again, louder, "Thomas, are you there?" Nothing, only the distant rustling of leaves and the lonely crowing of a crow somewhere above. Eleanor took 2 steps onto the trail, but something made her stop. It wasn't fear. It was a strange feeling, as if the air there was denser, heavier, as if the forest itself was watching. She glanced to either side, into the darkness between the trees, and felt a chill run down her spine. She backed away. She returned home quickly, almost running, and went straight to the house of Jacob Henley, Thomas's employer. Henley was sitting on the porch, smoking his pipe, when Eleanor arrived. She was pale, breathless. She asked if Thomas had been at the workshop that morning. Henley said no. She asked if he knew where Thomas might be. Henley shook his head. "I'll gather some men," he said, standing up. "We'll look for him." At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a group of 8 men gathered at the edge of the woods. Jacob Henley, William Grent, the farmer, 2 sawmill workers, Reverend Whitmore, and 3 neighbors. They carried lanterns, axes, ropes. Grent told the others that he had seen Thomas enter the woods that morning, standing still, looking into the trees, as if he were waiting for something. "He was acting strange," Grent said. "He didn't answer when I called out to him. He just went in." Henley led the search. They entered the main trail, the one hunters had used for decades, calling Thomas's name every few feet. The forest was silent. There was no birdsong. There was no wind. Only the sound of boots crushing dry leaves and the low rustling of branches above. After an hour, they found the first sign. It was Thomas's lantern. It was in the middle of the trail, fallen on its side. The glass cracked and kerosene spilled on the ground. The base of the lantern was cold. Henley picked it up, examined it, and said, "He was here. But when?" Grant looked around and pointed to the ground. "Look, there were footprints, boot prints, deep in the mud following the trail. They were heavy, spaced apart, as if someone had been walking slowly, with long, deliberate strides. They followed the footprints. The trail narrowed, climbing up the hills, going deeper and deeper into the woods. The trees grew closer together, the branches intertwining above, creating a dark green canopy that blocked out almost all the light. The air was colder, more humid. It smelled of wet earth, moss, something ancient. After another half hour, the footprints disappeared. They just stopped. In the middle of a small clearing surrounded by twisted trees, Thomas's footprints ended abruptly as if he had been torn from the ground. Henley looked around, confused. "This doesn't make sense." One of the sawmill workers, a man named Peter Hall, pointed to the ground. "Look at this." There, where the footprints ended, were strange marks in the dirt. They weren't human footprints. They were deep, dragged grooves, as if something heavy had been pulled, or as if something had come out of the ground. Reverend Whitmore crossed himself. "Let's go back. It's getting dark." But Henley insisted. "We can't leave Thomas here. He's somewhere. He has to be." They searched until dusk, combing through bushes, streams, animal burrows. They shouted Thomas's name until they were hoarse, but they found nothing. No sign, no trail, no sound. When night fell, Henley finally agreed to return. The men walked down the trail in silence, looking back every few steps, as if something were following them. That night, Eleanor did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with a candle lit, staring at the door, waiting to hear Thomas's heavy footsteps, the creak of the door, his voice saying that everything was fine, that he had just gotten lost. But the door remained closed. The next day, Sunday, Reverend Whitmore organized a larger search party. 20 men from the village, some from neighboring farms, combed the woods all day. They brought hunting dogs. The dogs sniffed the lantern, barking, pulling on their chains, running along the trail to the clearing where the footprints ended. And there the dogs stopped. They began to whine, to back away. One of them lay down on the ground, trembling, refusing to go on. The dog's owner, an experienced hunter named Edmund Ford, said he had never seen his dogs act like this. "They're sensing something," he murmured. "Something that isn't natural." The search was called off. On Monday, the Taunton police were notified. An inspector named Charles Pembroke arrived at Thornridge on Tuesday, accompanied by 2 officers. They questioned Eleanor, Jacob Henley, William Grant, and everyone else who had participated in the search. Pembroke examined the lantern, the footprints, the clearing. He couldn't explain it. "Men don't just disappear like this," he said to Henley in a tone of frustration. "There's always something, always." But there was nothing. The search continued for another week, but little by little the volunteers gave up. Life had to go on, the crops couldn't wait, families needed to eat. Eleanor was left alone, waiting. And on the 10th night after the disappearance, she heard something. It was late, the children were asleep, the house was dark. She was lying in bed, eyes open, when she heard footsteps outside. Heavy footsteps, slow, familiar. She got up slowly, her heart racing, and went to the window. Outside, in the darkness, she saw a silhouette. It was the shape of a man, standing on the road, motionless, looking at the house. Eleanor opened her mouth to call out, but no voice came out. The silhouette took a step back and disappeared into the darkness. Eleanor ran to the door, opened it, and shouted, "Thomas, Thomas, is that you?" But the street was empty. Only the wind, blowing cold, bringing the distant smell of wet earth and rotten leaves. In the days that followed, Thornridge changed. It wasn't a visible change, something that could be pointed out or clearly described. It was something more subtle, more profound. Conversations in the streets became shorter. Doors began to be locked earlier. Children, who had previously played freely until dusk, were now called inside as soon as the sun began to set. No one spoke openly about Thomas Aldridge, but everyone thought about him. Eleanor stopped leaving the house. Neighbors brought bread, milk, Eggs, leaving the baskets on the doorstep and knocking lightly before leaving. She accepted them silently, thanking them with a wave from the window, but did not open the door. Arthur started sleeping in bed with his mother. Margaret cried every night, calling for her father. Mrs. Crowley, who lived 3 houses down, said years later that she saw Eleanor standing at the window at night, looking down the road, waiting. She was waiting for him to come back, Crowley testified, every night, for months, as if he would suddenly appear, as if nothing had happened. Jacob Henley closed the workshop for a week out of respect for Thomas. When he reopened, he hired another carpenter, an older man from a neighboring village, but never spoke of Thomas to his customers again. When someone asked, he just shook his head and changed the subject. Inspector Pembroke returned to Thornridge twice, in November and then in December, trying to find something he had overlooked. He questioned William Grent again, asking for exact details of what he had seen that morning. Grent repeated the same story. He was standing still looking into the trees. I called out to him. He didn't answer. He took a step forward and disappeared, as if the forest had swallowed him up. Pembroke asked, "Did you see anyone else? Anything moving? Strange sounds?" Grent hesitated. Then he said slowly, "There was silence. A silence that wasn't normal, as if everything had stopped. Even the birds, even the wind." Pembroke wrote everything down, but in the official report, written weeks later, he concluded only, "Disappearance without cause. No evidence of foul play. Possible accident or voluntary escape." But Pembroke didn't believe it. He told Reverend Whitmore in private conversation that something was wrong. Men don't just disappear like that. They don't leave everything behind. They don't leave their wives, children, tools, money. Something happened in that forest. Something I can't explain. Whitmore just nodded and said nothing. In January 1898, 3 months after the disappearance, a shepherd named Henry Dobson was leading his flock through the hills near the forest when one of his sheep strayed from the group. Dobson followed it uphill, shouting, trying to bring it back, until the sheep stopped abruptly at the top of a rocky outcrop, looking down. Dobson approached and saw it. It was an axe, small, rusty from rain and weather. It was stuck in a fallen tree, as if someone had tried to cut a branch and then abandoned the tool there. Dobson recognized the axe. It belonged to Thomas. He took the axe to the village and handed it over to Inspector Pembroke, who returned to Thornridge immediately. Pembroke examined the spot where the axe had been found. It was almost 2 miles from the clearing where the footprints ended. There were no trails there. There was no reason for Thomas to be in that place. Pembroke asked Jacob Henley if Thomas had any reason to go to that part of the hill. Henley said no. No one went there. It was too far, too steep. There was no good firewood, no game, nothing to justify the climb. The axe was returned to Eleanor. She held it for a long moment, running her fingers over the rusty blade, feeling its familiar weight. Then, without saying a word, she put it under her bed next to the map Thomas had drawn. But the map had changed. Eleanor swore the map was different. The lines, once tortuous and disorganized, now seemed to form a pattern, a path. She showed the map to Reverend Whitmore, who examined it by candlelight and frowned. "It looks like a spiral," he said, tracing the lines with his finger, "or a maze, as if he were trying to map something that has no fixed shape." Whitmore asked if he could keep the map to study it. Eleanor agreed. But the next morning, when Whitmore went to look for the map in the desk where he had left it, it was gone. It had simply disappeared. In March, a child found something on the bank of the stream that ran through the village. It was a piece of fabric, dark gray wool, the kind used in heavy winter coats. It was dirty, torn, but still recognizable. Eleanor identified the fabric immediately. It was from Thomas's coat. The piece of fabric was found almost 5 kilometers from where he disappeared, in the opposite direction. Pembroke organized a final search, following the course of the stream, combing the banks, the backwaters, the stone bridges, but they found nothing else. The piece of fabric was all they had. And then, in April, exactly 1 year after Thomas's behavior began to change, Eleanor received a letter. There was no sender. There was no stamp. Someone had left it under the door during the night. The letter was handwritten in black ink, in shaky handwriting. It simply said, "He found his way. Don't look for him anymore. Some places don't allow return. He is where he always wanted to be. Forgive him." Eleanor showed the letter to Inspector Pembroke. Pembroke studied it for days, trying to identify the handwriting, the type of paper, the ink. But he couldn't. The letter held no clues, no fingerprints, no marks. "Who wrote this?" Eleanor asked, her voice breaking. Pembroke shook his head. "I don't know, but I think it's someone who knew what Thomas was looking for." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes red from crying. "And what was he looking for?" Pembroke hesitated. Then he said slowly, "I don't know, Mrs. Aldridge, but I think he found it." Eleanor never spoke of Thomas again after that day. She raised her children alone, working as a laundress, a seamstress, doing anything to feed Arthur and Margaret. The years passed. Arthur grew up, became a carpenter like his father, married, had children. Margaret moved to London, married a merchant, never returned to Thornridge. Eleanor lived to be 72. She died in 1923 on a quiet winter afternoon, sitting in the same chair where she waited for Thomas every night. In the inventory of her belongings, they found a wooden box under the bed. Inside the box was the rusty axe, the cracked lantern, and a piece of yellowed paper. It was the map, but it was blank, completely blank, as if nothing had ever been drawn on it. Today, more than a century later, Thornridge no longer exists. The village was slowly abandoned over the decades. Families moved to larger cities when the railroads expanded, when factories began to offer more stable jobs, when the old world finally gave way to the new. By the 1950s, only 3 houses were still inhabited. In 1970, the last family left. Today, all that remains of Thornridge are ruins. Stone walls covered in ivy, collapsed roofs, empty windows that look out onto nothingness. St. Mary's Church still stands, but without a roof or doors. It is just a stone skeleton where birds nest and the wind howls on winter nights. The home of Thomas and Eleanor Aldridge was demolished in 1963 to make way for a barn that was never built. The land today is just a field of tall grass where tourists sometimes stop to take pictures of the hills. But the woods are still there. The same trees, the same paths. The same cold, damp gloom that made Eleanor retreat that October afternoon. Modern maps mark the area as Blackthorn Forest, a name no one in Thornridge used. In historical records, the place is described only as the woods, with no official name, no precise coordinates, as if it were a place that existed on the margins of geography. There are no signs indicating what happened there. There are no monuments. There are no gravestones. Thomas Aldridge has no grave. Just a line in the Somerset County Missing Persons Registry, filed in 1898, marked unsolved. But the case was never forgotten. Over the years, other disappearances were reported in that same region. In 1912, a hunter named Albert Finch went out to track deer and never returned. In 1935, 2 teenagers camping near the woods disappeared overnight. Their tents were found intact, with food, clothes, everything in place, but they were never seen again. Local authorities always treated these cases as accidents, falls into ravines, animal attacks, disorientation, hypothermia, but the older residents of the area knew. They knew that this forest was not ordinary. In 1987, a local historian named David Hargrove published a small book about unexplained disappearances in southwest England. One of the chapters was dedicated to Thomas Aldridge. Hargrove interviewed descendants of people who had lived in Thornridge, examined parish records, police reports, personal diaries. He discovered something interesting. In ancient Celtic records, even before the Roman occupation, that area was called Ancosan Cailte, the Lost Way. It was considered a liminal place, a border between the visible world and something beyond. The Druids performed rituals there, not to invoke anything, but to seal something, to keep something on the other side. Hargrove also found medieval references. In the 13th century, a Benedictine monk wrote in a manuscript that there are paths in the hills of Somerset that lead nowhere, but to those who follow them, they lead forever. Hargrove tried to explore the woods himself. He entered the same trail Thomas Aldridge used, followed it to the clearing where the footprints ended, and felt exactly what Eleanor felt that afternoon. Something in the air, something invisible, something that shouldn't be there. He returned before nightfall. In the book he wrote, "There are places in the world that don't follow the rules, places where time bends, where geography lies, where what should be impossible becomes simply real." Thomas Aldridge found one of those places, and he paid the price that everyone pays when they go too far. The book sold few copies. It was forgotten. Hargrove died in 1999 of natural causes, never having returned to the woods. But he left a final handwritten note on the last page of his personal diary, discovered by his daughter years later. "I dreamed about Thomas Aldridge last night. He was standing in the clearing, lantern in hand, looking at me. He didn't say anything. He just looked, as if he were trying to warn me, as if he were saying, 'Don't come, don't follow, don't search.'" Arthur Aldridge, Thomas's son, lived until 1964. He became a carpenter, like his father, but never spoke about him. When his own children asked about their grandfather, Arthur would simply say, "He's gone. That's all you need to know." But shortly before he died, Arthur told his daughter, Catherine, something, and she recorded the conversation in a diary. Arthur said, "My mother told me years later that my father was looking for something. He believed there was a place in the woods where time did not exist, where you could go in and never grow old, never suffer, never die. He believed that the ancients knew about it, that there was a way." Catherine asked, "And did he find it?" Arthur looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I think so, and I think it killed him, or worse." Catherine asked, "Worse how?" Arthur didn't answer. He just closed his eyes and never spoke of it again. Today the forest remains, untouched, silent. Few venture there. Those who do usually return quickly, uneasy, unable to explain why. Some say you can still find footprints in the clearing, footprints that shouldn't be there, footprints that disappear into thin air. Others say that on certain October nights, when the fog rises from the valley and covers the hills, you can see a faint light among the trees. A light that moves slowly, like a lantern carried by someone walking unhurriedly. And if you stay long enough, if you look closely, you will see a silhouette, standing, motionless, looking back at you. Thomas Aldridge disappeared in October 1897. Eleanor waited for him until the day she died. Arthur carried his father's silence with him throughout his life. Margaret never returned to Thornridge. The woods remain, and there are questions that have no answers. There are paths that lead nowhere, and there are men who take a step forward and never return, because sometimes one more step is all it takes.